Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Mem Amud Aleph, 40a of Maseches Kiddushin. The very, very end of the page, the last two words, the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Le'olam, at all times, top of the next page, Le'olam yireh adam atzmo ki'ilu chetzio chayev v'chetzio zakai. At all times, a person should view himself, or herself, as if he is half chayav, half obligated, responsible, and half meritorious. Meaning a person should view their mitzvos and their averos and their sins as equal, and that the next one, will tilt the scales. Whatever I do next is going to determine which side I end up on. So if a person goes through life in such a way, then they'll if they think in that way, they will hopefully always choose the right thing to do the mitzvah. And they should think, Asa mitzvah achas, if he then does one mitzvah, ashrav, so he's very fortunate, sheichriyas atzmo l'kaf zechus, because then he tilted himself to the side of the scales of merit. Avar avera achas, but if instead this person would transgress one avera, Oila, woe to him, sheichriyas atzmo l'kaf chova. Woe to him that he now tilted himself towards the side of obligation, of greater responsibility or chova. He's now on the side of not being meritorious, being chayav. Shenemar, as the verse says, v'chote echad ye'avad tova harbe. That one sin causes much loss. And that what that teaches is bishvil chet yechidi shechata, for one sin that he sinned, oved mimenu tovos harbe. He loses many good things. He's woe to him. He loses out on much because every avera of course does that, but especially one that will tilt the scales away from merit. So that would be especially impactful. Just one sin can have that tremendous impact. Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon Omer, Rabbi Elazar the son of Reb Shimon says, L'fi sheha'olam nidon acharuba. The world at large is judged based on the majority. V'ayachad nidon acharuba. And an individual is also judged based on the majority. So, while every avera and every mitzvah certainly counts towards something and has a profound impact on a person and on all the spiritual realms, but to some degree there's a scale that and whichever one is in the majority is going to determine certain outcomes. So Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon says the world is judged based on the majority and the individual is judged based on the majority. So asa mitzvah achas, if he does just one mitzvah, Ashrav, he's fortunate. He didn't just tilt. It could be that he's not just tilting himself to the side of merit, he's tilting the whole world. And if he sins one sin, he moved himself and the whole world possibly to the side of sin, of being unmeritorious. Shenemar, again, he quotes the same verse, V'chote echad chule, one sin takes away many goods, b'shvel chet yechidi, she'asa zeh. Because of this single sin that this individual did, avad mimenu mikol ha'olam tova harbe. He caused goodness to be lost, not just from him, but from the whole world. So, Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon is just building on the previous teaching and saying that it's not only the individual who could be affected by this, but it's the whole world at large. That it could be the whole world is balanced right now, and whichever way a person goes, whether they choose to do a mitzvah or they choose to do an avera, whichever way they choose can tilt the scales of the entire world. And if a person goes through life with this outlook, so it will literally change the way that they conduct themselves. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai said, this would be the father of the just previously mentioned Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi Shimon, so his father was Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer, Afiu tzaddik gamar, kol yamav, even if you have a tzaddik gamar, someone who was a completely righteous person his entire life, umarad ba'achrona, but at the end he rebelled against God, ibed es harishonos, he loses all those mitzvahs that he did, all those early years of his life, they are lost. Shenemar, as the verse says, tzidkas hatzadik lo tatzilena b'yom pisho. The righteousness of the tzaddik won't save him on the day of his sin. So if in the end he becomes a sinner, all those mitzvahs that he did are not going to protect him. He's going to lose that. Vafyigu rasha gamor kol yamav v'asa tshuva b'achrona. And the same is true the opposite. You have a rasha, a wicked person their whole life. A person spent their life in sin, and then in the end they do tshuva, they repent, they change their ways. We don't remind him anymore of his rishus, of his wickedness, of his days when he was sinning. Shenemar, as the verse says, v'rishas harasha lo yikashel ba b'yom shuvo me'risho. The risha, the wickedness of the rasha, we will not trip him up when he returns from his wickedness and when he repents. So it won't trip him up, meaning it won't be mentioned, it won't come up, it won't be considered anymore. If the person does tshuva, so all of that bad stuff goes away. So Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says, if a person is a tzaddik their whole life, they're doing mitzvahs their whole life, very righteous, but in the end they turn sour and they become a sinner, they lose all those mitzvahs that they did. And the same is true, the opposite for a person who is wicked their whole life, person spends their life in sin, but then they do tshuva, then they repent, all those sins are forgotten. So the Gemara is bothered by this. The Gemara asks, why does a person lose everything that they did? You know, especially on the side of the mitzvahs, the person spent their whole life doing mitzvahs, and then their last few months of their life, they fell, prey to their temptations and they started to sin. Why do they lose everything? We should look at the scale, and it should be, maybe, he says half and half, but if it comes out to half and half, then it should be half and half, but it should just, like if a person was sinning throughout their life, we said we have a scale, but that the mitzvahs and the averos get balanced. God has his way of judging, but there's a balance. So how come if it's all mitzvahs at the beginning and all averos at the end, it's not just scaled out? So it should be put on the scale again. So the Gemara answers, Amar Reish Lakish b'toeh al harishonos. We're talking about where he regrets all those first actions. If the person regrets all the mitzvahs that they did, so then they lose them. So if a person does mitzvahs their whole life, and then in the end they fall to temptation, but they realize, all those mitzvahs were valuable, and they still appreciate all that good that they did, so then those mitzvahs will still count. But if at the end of their life they say, "Oh, what a waste of time! I was wasting my whole life doing mitzvahs. I regret all of that." So then that's taking off the ledger. Those mitzvahs no longer count for them. That's what Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was talking about. That they lose all those mitzvahs. That's where they regret having done them. And perhaps it's the same on the flip side for the averos. If a person does tshuva and regrets all the averos that they did, so those could be taken away. If they don't regret them, then they're not going to be taken away. Okay, the next Mishnah continues and it says, Kol sheyeshno b'mikro v'mishnah u'v'derech haaretz. If a person has these three things, they have Mishnah. So they've learned Mishnah, they've learned halacha. Mishnah could probably include potentially Talmud. They've learned the halachos. It starts with Mikra. Anybody who has Mikra. Mikra is Chumash, Tanakh, the written Torah. Uva Mishnah, they have the oral Torah. They have the halachos. Uva Derech Eretz, and they have Derech Eretz. They conduct themselves nicely with others. Lo b'meirahu chote. That person will not easily succumb to sin. That is a three-pronged defense mechanism against sin. Shenemar, as the verse says, If you have a thread that's three threads, three strings together, I guess, it won't rip easily. It won't be cut easily. That's a very strong rope. So if you have this trifecta, you have the Mikra, you have Chumash, you know Torah, the written Torah, you know Mishnah, the written Torah, and you live with Derech Eretz. So all those three things together will protect a person from sin. Because she'eino lo b'mikra v'lo Mishnah lo b'derech Eretz. And if a person has none of those, eino min ha'yishuv. They don't belong in society. Such a person is not someone who belongs in society, especially if they don't have derech eretz, if they don't have, they can't conduct themselves properly around others. Eino min ha'yishuv, they're not someone who should be a part of society. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Elazar v'Rabbi Tzadok. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, said, Lema tzadikim nimshalim b'olam hazeh. To what can tzaddikim be compared to in this world? And he's addressing the major question about why do the righteous suffer, why do the wicked prosper. So he says, those tzaddikim that we see, people are righteous and yet they're suffering, what can we compare them to? Le'ilan shekulo omed b'makom taira. We can compare it to a tree that is growing in a place of purity. V'nofo nota l'makom tuma. But the branches extend to a place of tuma, a place that is tameh, a place that's impure. And it seems in the mashal it's not all the branches, but some of the branches go out to a place that's impure. Niktzas nofo, if you cut off those branches, kula omid makom tara, then the tree is now completely standing in a place of purity. There's no impurity left. That's the mashal, that's the parable, the metaphor. Kach HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so too, God, mevi yisurim al tzadikim b'olam hazeh, God brings suffering upon the righteous in this world, kedei sheyirshu ha'olam haba, in order that they inherit the world to come. Shenemar, as the verse says, v'haya reishischa mitzar, v'acharischa yisket ma'od, that your beginning will be in pain and suffering, but your end will be increased greatly. So the idea is that in the mashal and the nimshal, we have this tree. It's pure. It's full of it's righteous. It's full of good deeds. It has a little bit of tumah to it. It has some of its branches are extended over an impure place, and that's the mashal for a person who's righteous. You have a person who's righteous. They have here and there a few mistakes. They have a few sins. So in order to make them, to purify them, to cleanse them, and so that they are completely pure when they're ready to go to the world to come, so therefore they have to suffer a little bit in this world. And that sort of cuts off that impure part. That way the impure part of the tree is now cut off, and we're left with only a pure tree in order to go to the world to come with no impurities. And that's the life of a tzaddik, why sometimes a tzaddik suffers in this world. And that's that verse that he quoted in Eov, your beginning will be suffering, but your end will be increased greatly as a result. And what can we compare the wicked to in this world? To a tree that is standing in an impure place. It's growing in an impure place. And so the majority of the tree is in an impure place. But its branches extend to a place of purity. So this is the opposite. We have a person who's full of sins, and they have here and there some merits. Niktas nofo, if those branches that are extending over a place of purity get cut off, kula omid b'makom tumas, and the whole thing is left in a place of tumah. We just have something impure remaining. So kach HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so too God, mashpia lahen tova l'rishayim b'olam hazeh. HaKadosh Baruch Hu provides good to the wicked in this world, in order to trouble them and bring them down to the lowest levels in the next world. Shenemar, as the verse says, Yesh derech yasher lifnei ish v'acharisa darkei mavis. You can have a straight path before a person. I guess a person's kind of living the straight road in life. He's experiencing prosperity. And in the end are the ways of death. Meaning what waits for him is death, meaning the punishment in the next world. So a rasha, someone who's wicked, the majority of what he does is wicked. He has going for him a couple of merits. So to kind of round him out and prepare him for his proper greeting in the next world, what's really due to him, so he gets his reward for his whatever those few righteous deeds are in this world, he gets that reward. And that, so to speak, cuts off those branches of purity, of righteousness. He got that, it's rewarded, and then all that's left is what this person really is, which is someone wicked, someone who's impure, and that's what will go on to the next world. Okay. Continues the Gemara, just discussing some, sort of interesting philosophical questions. It says, "Ukvar haya Rabbi Tarfon uzakenim misubim ba'aliyas beis nitzeh belud." Rabbi Tarfon and the elders were dining in the upper levels of the house of Nitzeh in the city of Lud. V'nishala she'ela zu bifneim, and the following question was proposed before them, or was posed before them. Talmud gadol o maisa gadol. What is greater, learning or doing? What is greater, for a person to engage in learning Torah, or for a person to actually go out and do mitzvos? So, Nane Rabbi Tarfon ve'amar, Rabbi Tarfon answered, and he said, Maisa gadol. The good deeds are greater. It's more important to be active in mitzvahs than to be learning Torah. Nane Rabbi Akiva ve'amar, Talmud gadol. Rabbi Akiva said, no, learning is better. Learning is more important. Nanu kulam ve'amru, and then they all answered together and said, Talmud gadol she'Talmud mevi lidei ma'aseh. That learning is greater because the learning actually brings you to good deeds. Then you have both. So I think what's going on here is really they were agreeing the whole time. They were just looking at it in different ways. Rabbi Tarfon was looking at the end goal. The end goal is, now there is of course learning as a goal in itself is a goal. But without Maisa, without mitzvos, then it's problematic. So Rabbi Tarfon was saying that which is greater. A person has to have Maisa, a person has to have mitzvos. Rabbi Akiva was saying a person has to have learning. Really, they were saying the same thing, because in order to do the mitzvahs properly, a person has to learn. So Rabbi Akiva was saying that, Maisa might be good, but without limud Torah, without learning, then it's not going to be done properly. So they both said together that learning is greater because it will bring you to Maisa, to good deeds, and to do them properly, and then you'll have both. So they came out saying the same thing in the end. Tanya Rabbi Yossi Omer. Rabbi Yossi, the Brisa says that Rabbi Yossi says, Gadol Talmud. Learning is so great, shekadam lechala arba'im shana. Learning Torah is so great, it came 40 years before the mitzvah of chala. The mitzvah of chala was given when we entered the land of Israel, or it became applicable when we entered the land of Israel. The mitzvah of chala is not, we don't mean like Friday night chala on Shabbos. By chala we mean the mitzvah to separate out a portion for the Kohanim from our dough. So that mitzvah kicked in when they entered the land of Israel. So Rabbi Yossi says that you see how great Torah study is, that we got it 40 years before, because we got the mitzvah of Torah study at Har Sinai already. That's when we got the Torah. And the mitzvah of Chala only came 40 years later. With Trumos Ulamaisros, Chamishim Varba. And it preceded the mitzvah of Torah study, preceded the mitzvah to separate Truma from our produce and to separate Meiser, to tithe our produce. it preceded it by 54 years. Because there were 40 years that they were in the desert before they got to the land of Israel. And then it took 14 years to conquer the land of Israel and establish it. So, and only then did the mitzvahs of Truma and Meiser begin. So that's 40 plus 14 is 54. L'shmitim shishim v'achas. And it was 61 years before Shemitah. Because 40 years in the desert, 14 years to conquer the land, and then they started the count toward Shemitah. So another 7 years, so 54 and 7 is 61. So it was that. So the mitzvah of learning Torah came 61 years before the mitzvah of Shemitah occurred for the first time. And Liyovlos Meya V'Shalosh, and 103 years before the first Yovel, because the first Yovel came 50 years after they settled the land. So it took them 40 years in the desert, plus 14 is 54, plus 50 is 103. No, it's not. 54 plus 50 is 104. So the Gemara says that it was 103 years before Yovel. The Gemara asks, Meya v'shalosh, 103, Meya v'arba havyan. It should be 104. So the Gemara explains, why did the Brisa say 103? Kasavar, because he held Yovel mitchilasohu meshamit. That Yovel actually, the laws of Yovel take effect at the beginning of the Yovel year. That the slaves go free, and land returns to its owner, all that stuff happens, we know, on Yom Kippur, but he holds that it happens on the Yom Kippur at the beginning of Yovel, not the Yom Kippur at the end of Yovel, like after, into the next year. So therefore, so therefore it's really 103, because it's the beginning of the 50th year that these come into effect. And therefore he said 103. And so that's just expressing one way of viewing how important Torah study is, that the mitzvah of Torah study was given so many years before these mitzvahs came into effect. And I suppose you also see the idea that Torah is such a prerequisite to the mitzvahs. We had all these years learning about those halachos before they actually came into effect, and that was a preparatory stage for applying the halachos. And the Gemara says, Ukeshem sha'alimod kodem l'maisa, and just like learning comes before action, you have to know what to do before you do the mitzvos, kach dino kodem l'maisa, so too we are judged regarding our Torah study before we're judged regarding our actual deeds, our actual mitzvah performance. Kidder Rav Hamnuna, like the teaching of Rav Hamnuna, Ta'amar Rav Hamnuna, as Rav Hamnuna said, Ein tchilas dino shel adam ela al divrei Torah. The beginning of a person's judgment, when he appears before God for judgment, will be about Torah study. Shenemar, as the verse says, Poter mayim reishis madam, a person who alleviated or exempted himself from mayim, from water, and water is a metaphor for Torah. So a person who exempted himself from Torah, reishis madam, that's the first thing he's judged on. So the first thing a person's judged on is, did they study Torah properly? Ukeshem shadino kodem l'maisa, and just like the judgment for Torah study comes before the judgment for maisa, for our deeds, kach schara kodem l'maisa, so too the reward for Torah study will come before the reward for our mitzvos. Shenemar, as the verse says in Tehillim, Vayiteng lohem artzos goyim, ve'ama le'umim yirshu. He will give to them, he gave to them the lands of the nations, and Va'ama la'amim yirshu, they'll inherit something from the nations, not clear exactly, but the point is, the next part, Ba'avor yishmeru chukav, because, why are they rewarded? Because yishmeru chukav, because they guarded the statutes, v'taros of yinzaru, and they guarded the Torahs, the teachings. But the word yishmeru chukav, because they guarded the statutes, what does it mean, yishmeru? So Rashi explains that the Gemara said earlier, back on Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph 37a, that Tishmerun, in a verse quoted there, refers to Mishnah, refers to learning. So Yishmeru Chukav, to guard the statutes, means to learn about them. And Tarosa means Torah, and they guarded the Torah. Different type of guarding, protected, maybe is the actual deeds. So first, the reward for Yishmeru Chukav is mentioned first. For learning, that's mentioned first, that they'll receive this reward of land and prosperity as a result of learning the halachos. So we see that the reward for learning comes before the reward for good deeds. Okay, we will hold here, and God willing, next week we will finish the first parak of Kiddushin, the longest parak in all of Shas. Looking forward.